All right, here we go. Another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. We're going to do two more villages today. The village of Aleknagik and the community. I don't know if I want to say village because I've been to this place many times and usually known as a community of Alexander Creek. So let's start with Aleknagik. Aleknagik is in southwest Alaska. It is on Aleknagik Lake and the Wood River. The Wood River flows out of Aleknagik Lake and into the ocean. Aleknagik is 16 miles northwest of Dillingham. And it is historically, this is really interesting. Historically, it was used as summer fish camps. Now in Alaska, fish camps are places historically where native Alaskans would go to catch their fish, and they would cut it up, and then they would have smokehouses and smoke the fish. It's kind of like a annual community event. Really neat annual tradition in with the native fish camps there. And you can imagine kids playing around, swimming in the water, and having fun while the adults are preparing the fish. And they smoke the fish, which of course tastes very delicious. And of course, it's very just a very life-giving tradition. And so historically, Aleknagik Lake and the Wood River was a location where these fish camps took place. Now, Aleknagik means the wrong way home, which is quite interesting. And it's called that because the legend is that native returning to their homes along the Nushagak River would sometimes get lost in the fog, and they would get swept up in the Wood River because of the ocean tides. The river would inadvertently pull them up to Aleknagik Lake. And so they began calling it Aleknagik, which means the wrong way home. Now, it first started being noticed as a community in 1929 when the U.S. Census found that there were 55 people living there, and at the time it was called the Wood River Village, named after the Wood River, which flows out of the lake there. In 1930, there were found 5 families living on the shores of the lake, and they lived there year-round. Their names were the Waskes, the Poleys, the Hansons, Yakos, and the Smiths. There was a school built there in 1933, and one of the Waskes became the first teacher there. Now, since the school came up, other facilities and plentiful fish, game and timber, and a number of families were attracted to this place from Good News Bay, from Togiak, Kulukak, and some of the people relocated to Aleknagik, drawn in by the school. A post office was established in 1937. In 1938, a 2-story frame school with a teacher's apartment was built. And by 1939, Aleknagik had grown to 78 residents and 30 buildings with a small sawmill. Then in the late 1940s, a Seventh-day Adventist mission and school was established. And this mission and this school were located on the South Shore. Now, Aleknagik is split up into the North Shore and the South Shore area, and they were, apart from each other because of the lake and the Wood River. So in 1959, the state of Alaska constructed a 25-mile road connecting the South Shore to the North Shore and ultimately to Dillingham. This road was passable only during summer months, but then in the 1980s, it was upgraded and maintained all year round. So now you can always pass through there. During the 1950s, a Moravian church and a Russian Orthodox church were built in Aleknagik. And at the time, there were 35 families living along the lake, whom the churches served. The current population of Aleknagik is 204, which is less than it used to be years back. The racial makeup of Aleknagik as of 2022 is about 59% American Indian, 37.5% of mixed race, and 2.5% white. So largely a Native American village still. Now, here's a couple of really interesting facts about Aleknagik. According to this, in the late 19th century, there was estimated to be about 200 people in the village and the surrounding area. However, at the time, some illnesses came in and killed most of the residents, and the area was largely abandoned. Until about 1930, one Yupik family living at the top of the Wood River in what's now Aleknagik. From there, the village grew to about 40 people by 1931 and continued to grow from there. And because the incoming of the Seventh day Adventists, Russian Orthodox, it became a village. It became incorporated in 1973 as an official village of Alaska. Another interesting historical thing is that the very famous Alaskan Senator Ted Stevens crashed, was killed in a plane crash near Aleknagik in August of 2010. And of course, he's probably the most famous senator in Alaska. Even the Anchorage International Airport is named after him. It's called the Ted Stevens International Airport. So that's quite an interesting thing. He passed away in a crash near Aleknagik. And finally, this interests me because I'm kind of a early explorer nerd. I've been reading a lot of books about the age of exploration. And according to some diaries of some Russian explorers from 1867, it looks like some of them traveled up to Aleknagik Lake. But the Russian spelling was a bit different, but if you sound it out, it sounds like Aleknagik. So it seems like the first outsiders to reach this area was in 1867 by Russian explorers. So I think that's just pretty interesting. And I'm just fascinated to know what they saw. But that's for another episode. All right, let's talk about Alexander Creek, Alaska. This is a place that I know fairly well. I've been there many times. Alexander Creek community sits at the base of Mount Susitna. Locally, Mount Susitna is known as the Sleeping Lady. If you look at it from the east of the mountain, looking west, it looks like a woman laying down on the ground, and so the locals here call it the Sleeping Lady. But it is Mount Susitna, and just to the east side of that mountain flows Alexander Creek, and this creek flows out of Alexander Lake. Mostly known locally for its very good northern pike fishing, and it flows down from Alexander Lake down, I think, about 75 miles or so into the Big Sioux or the Susitna River. Now, according to nps.gov, near the mouth of Alexander Creek, there are some ancient archeological sites indicating some previous native people living in this area. Now, I have spent some time in this area. I have not seen these archaeological sites personally, and in my researching, I have not been able to find specific locations for these archaeological sites. But any clues at the people who were here before, I am very fascinated by, which if you listen to this podcast regularly, then you probably know that. According to this, the community was first noted as a small Indian village in 1898 by the U.S. Geological Survey. It first shows up on a map drawn by a man named Eldridge, and that is the first indication of any records of people living in the Alexander Creek area. Now, today, the Alexander Creek community is largely people with cabins along the serene, slow-moving Clearwater Creek, and it's used as sort of a nice place to get away. I think there are people who live there year-round, but a lot of people just have cabins along there where they go and visit when they want to. And that's largely what the community is today. There has been some efforts to incorporate it as a native village. Back in the 1970s, there were some efforts to reincorporate it as a native village so that outsiders could not purchase land there. But this was denied as there was not enough support behind the idea. Now, in more recent history, the Alexander Creek area was a economic powerhouse because of the vibrant king salmon and other types of salmon fishing that was done along the creek. The salmon would come in from the ocean up the Susitna and make their way up the desirable, calm, clear waters of Alexander Creek, and many fishing lodges sprung up, and they did very, very well because of the abundance of fish. According to this article, it was likely the premier spot in the whole of MatSu Valley for salmon fishing. It says this was likely a multi-million-dollar salmon fishery with lodges and daily flight services and boat charters. However, the fishing returns have been so low lately that it's been closed to continued fishing in the area. And of course, this was economically devastating to the Alexander Creek community. Adding to the devastation of this area, it looks like sometime in the 1960s, northern pike were introduced to the Alexander Lake and Creek area. Now, northern pike are native to Alaska. However, they didn't seem to be prominent in these waters, but it's speculated that they were illegally introduced into the waters. Now, northern pike are kind of weak. I mean, I've grown up catching northern pike. They're just really fun to catch. They're very big. They're very aggressive fish. When you get them on the line, they can really fight. And so they're a lot of fun to catch, which could be why they were illegally introduced, because they're a great sport fish. However, they're a lot less desirable for eating than things like salmon or trout. But these northern pike, they eat everything. I mean, I call them monster fish. They just eat anything and everything, including the more desirable species of fish. They'll eat other salmon, they'll eat trout, and they kind of devastate fish populations wherever they go. And these, I have heard personally that out of Alexander Lake, you can catch record northern pike, just pull them out of the waters. But in addition, in 2014, there was another aquatic invasive plant introduced into these waters called Elodia. Elodia is a water plant that totally devastates the waters that they're in. By growing out wide, they can ruin propellers and they ruin fish habitats. It's believed that this plant was introduced by float planes. Now, I have flown float planes into these waters. Fortunately for me, I flew in there after 2014, so just for the record, it wasn't me. But at any rate, with the introduction of northern pike and this invasive plant species and the wild reduction of salmon running up the Alexander Creek, the economic devastation to Alexander Creek community was done. And now most of the people who live out there, it's simply like a place to get away, to enjoy God's creation, to enjoy nature. And that is what Alexander Creek is today. Now, since 2015, efforts by Alaska Department of Fish and Game have been underway to remove as many northern pike out of the creek as possible. And they have ways of monitoring how many pike are in there and how many of the Chinook salmon are making their way up, which has been largely a successful effort to remove pike to allow the salmon to return. And it does sound like that the effort is showing really promising results for this area. Other efforts to remove this invasive plant species is also underway, and they're working on bringing this place back to its original state. And who knows, maybe one day the fishing industry will return to the Alexander Creek community. But for now, it does seem like it's mostly, it's quite an intimate, sweet community. Most of the people know each other. I have snow machined out there many times myself, and the neighbors help each other and they know each other. There is a Facebook group where they post updates, on the status of the ice and can you still snow machine there. Or this time of year, here in late October, they're monitoring the ice for the float planes getting in and out of the creek. I have personally landed my float plane on the creek many times and also on nearby sandbars. If you listen to a previous episode, out by the mouth of the Alexander Creek is where I flipped a plane upside down, landing on a sandbar with snow, and was not the greatest day of my flying career. But it's those kinds of incidents where it made me a better pilot, more cognizant of the dangers of flying in Alaska. So I'm thankful for Alexander Creek and my experience there. It is a beautiful, serene place if you ever have a chance to visit. Okay, so that concludes our profiles for the villages of Aleknagik and Alexander Creek, Alaska. And I'd like to end today's episode with something I found during my research on Alexander Creek was from a guy named Ruben Gaines. Ruben Gaines is kind of an Alaskan storyteller, best known for his radio program called Conversations Unlimited. Now, he died back in 1994, and he published a handful of books of poetry, and he was all about life in Alaska. And apparently, Ruben Gaines, being the wordsmith that he is a good way to conclude today's episode on his thoughts on Alexander Creek community, which he apparently visited. So I wanted to share with you his words about this beautiful community. Here they are.
On a superlative day, mainly clear but with just a few fat capitalistic clouds taking it easy aloft, there are any number of places one would like to be, all out of town. Just as an idle choice, this could call for a flight the length of Alexander Creek that meanders about 75 miles as the grayling swims from the lake of that name to the Susitna River. That neighborhood, the whole length of it, turns an observer into a millionaire in terms of green, blue, and gold. In sunshiny times, the compounded interest can rub off on him, and for the time being, he can't imagine poverty. Alexander Creek is an individual, though not necessarily a unique one. There are other such winding thoroughfares like the Talshalitna that winds around Beluga Mountain, or the Salcha River in the interior, or the snake-like Inoko in the southwest country. Most of these can supply standing congregations of spruce, birch, and cottonwood, and the same plunging blue water. What's fascinating to me about these meandering streams that double back on each other in ever-tightening curves is their likeness to a serpent shedding its skin as they leave their old channels behind in trying to find a more direct route to the sea. Those abandoned beds, year by year, lie farther away from the creek's changing channels, and they finally disappear into the undergrowth. This aspect of the creek's progress, I was thinking of Alexander in particular, brought out this effort in verse, which incidentally winds all over the written page as well. The creek remakes its restless bed 1,000 times before the many miles of crooked course are run. Abandoned curves and arcs and channels ring the route with their remains. The pebbled skeletons of beds and crumbling banks and labyrinths of winding wild young growth are strewn behind. A jumble of destruction and beginnings, as the creek, recalling when creation strode through here and pointed out the passage to the sea, claws with its rapids for the newer, quicker way.